This book that we're here to talk about this morning has had so much media coverage that my plan really was to try and tease out some of the things from between the lines, some of the things that possibly Kristin has not yet told us, and go, as it were, beyond the covers, or maybe even beneath the covers. Who knows? So that's my plan for this morning. Let's see whether it works. Kristin, you spent 2 years asking David questions. Was there a particularly apt moment to choose in the day when he was at his most vulnerable?
Yes, I have to say, when he's hungry at lunchtime. Because I would be writing away and I'd have forgotten the time to be about 2:30, and about 3 o'clock a faint voice would come from downstairs. "Are we having lunch today?" And I would then say, "Yes, we are, I'm making it. But just a couple of questions I've got here." And he would be very generous.
Next year you're going to be a candidate for that empty chair. Torture, denial of food. David, do you keep letters and diaries? Are you a kind of archivist of your own life?
I did. I just used to keep a cardboard box, and everything that came in, I'd chuck it in the box. And then my accountant said, "Have you got a record of your stuff?" And I said, "Yeah, I throw it all into a box. I've got boxes there." He said, "Well, you can give it to the National Library and they'll value it and give it to you as a tax deduction." That would be a very good thing to do. The problem was I hadn't done any sorting. I'd just thrown everything in there. And even my wife got a surprise when she went to the National Library and saw some stuff I'd forgotten I'd put in there.
Well, that's interesting because you went together, and in fact you, David, were in the role of Kristin's assistant at that stage. So when you went and looked at those boxes in the National Library, which I see have got restricted access, so we'll all be dead before we get access to them, what did you find in the boxes that surprised you, where you realised that there were things about each other or about life together that you'd forgotten?
Well, there were letters, lots of letters, some that I'd written to David that I'd forgotten about, some that our children had written to him, and some that strange women had written to him. And I could always tell because they were on pink paper and they had a particular perfume. And no, this is a bit mean. There are 2 or 3 of those, but I did find them intriguing because I'd never heard of these people. And when I asked David who they were, he'd say, "I can't remember. I really can't remember." But this may or may not have been true. But when I went down to the library, he came with me, and he did come just as my assistant to sharpen the pencils and push around the trolleys of files and do the photocopying. And the chief librarian was most amused. But yes, he was...
It's like being asked to prepare the scaffold for your own execution.
Did you find, David, that when you looked at the material that Kristin was sifting through, that you were surprised at some of the material in there? Did it bring back things that you hadn't remembered?
Yes, it did, and things that I didn't want to remember, unfortunately. But the pact was that if Kristin was going to do this book, I had no right to censor what she was doing. I had the right to look at it and factually correct errors, if they were errors of fact, but had no powers of censorship.
I used to let him read the book at the end of each chapter, just to check for, yes, factual errors.
And did you do that before dinner time, so that if you...
No, I had to pick the right moment for that.
One of the big surprises for me of the book, I have to say, David, is that there are a number of times when you resort to using your fists. There are a couple of punch-ups where you go for someone's jaw or you push some critic back over a piano, and it made me wonder, when are words not enough?
No, it's only happened twice. And one of them, well, he wasn't a critic, he was a fellow artist in another field, and he was a bad drunk, and he became progressively more and more insulting throughout the evening, and I hung on to it then my hand took over. I just went... I couldn't stop. It was involuntary, but he was appallingly insulting. That's all I can say in my defence. So it occasionally happens. You get picked out at dinner parties by some disgruntled person, and normally I'm fairly calm. I just take it and take it. But unfortunately, I've got a trigger point if it goes too much. couple of times I didn't hit the critic. I've never hit a critic. I've chased one, but
He ran very fast.
yeah.
I was going to say those legs would have to win, surely.
Yeah.
Well, I'm on notice now. I know about the trigger temper. Kristin, you come from a Scandinavian family background, a stoic, stiff upper lip kind of family. So were you quite sort of surprised by David's hypersensitivity to things like criticism?
Yes, I was initially. I thought, it doesn't matter what they say, you know this work is good. And some critics, of course, are very constructive, and they say, if you'd only done this, it might have been better. And there's no problem with those critics. But it's those who say, well, you don't know what you're doing, and you should have done this, and that sort of thing that drive him a bit insane. I must say that I had this superior attitude to not having been in the position where I was criticised until I wrote my first novel, which was a long time ago now. And I remember being shocked as a critic, really kind of got stuck into it. And I thought, oh, how dare they? This is my offering. You know, I've prepared it for 2 years. And I did sympathise with David then. I understood
In fact, you had fantasies of stuffing her head down a toilet and pushing the button.
I wasn't going to go into that.
Well, yeah.
No, that's a bit much. But yes, I did have such a fantasy, I admit.
Look, I am sensitive. Most playwrights are, because playwrights deal with the undercurrents to human behaviour. My plays are about the power plays, the status games, the put-downs under the surface of polite conversation. So if I wasn't sensitive to those put-downs and slights, I wouldn't be a playwright.
And I guess
it goes with the territory.
You can't switch that radar off necessarily.
No.
Just when you walk out into the foyer, you can't suddenly become a different animal.
I know when someone's being condescending to me. If I was thick, if I was socially insensitive, all this would just go over my head. But I know when someone's getting at me, even though they're pretending they're not. And that's the stuff in my plays. People niggling each other, power games, status games, all of that. It's surprising. David Hare, the English playwright, is far more sensitive than I am.
Yes, he's quite prickly. That's true.
He tirades. I met him in London once, and one of the critics had said, as if by luck, David Hare has put his finger on the very pulse of England. And I would have died for that. And he was saying, as if by luck, it was not luck.
Well, then tell me this. Do you see in yourself, do you recognise in yourself that anger is a kind of creative fuel or juice, and that you get your anger out on the page about various social behaviours?
Yes, certainly that the times I've been humiliated by subtext, sniping and all of that makes it very easy for me when I write a character who's being humiliated to get angry. And, look, truthfully, the area I work in, I couldn't do it unless I was sensitive to, I had a radar for what's going on under the surface.
What about your creative fuel, Kristin, then? I mean, what do you think has driven you as a journalist and as a novelist? I mean, it's not anger in your case, is it?
No, stories. I just love stories. And people. I think as a journalist, I loved interviewing a wide range of people. I started with the arts because that's mainly all I knew, and then into social issues, and then eventually into politics too. And just doing that investigative type work where you really probe, but you try not to do it in such a way that the person's hackles come up and they're defensive. Often they don't know they're being probed. And I loved finding out about people and institutions and events and so forth. And then that fed later into stories about people I sort of knew. My first books, I think, were they were based on people I knew. But then after that, it went more into fantasy. So stories.
I'm curious to know, now that you're both spending most of your time up near Noosa, whether something has happened to either of you or both of you where you've gone into that kind of what I call sarong mentality, where you kind of wander around in your pyjamas all day and you make a couple of cups of coffee or you go out for a juice and you think about the work, but you leave it till later and later and it becomes a sort of manana state of mind. Do you think that becoming sea changers has has had any effect on your creativity, either of you?
Well, we certainly don't wander around like that. But we have a schedule, you know. We get up, we do our exercise. David walks in the national park. I go to the local pool and swim. And then we come back and have breakfast, read the papers, and start the day's work. We're fairly disciplined, aren't we?
Yeah, we're both workaholics, compulsive writers. I think that's why we can stand each other. I think because I understand her need to work and she understands my need to work. But the truth is we're down in Sydney about a third of the time. In any case, we've still got an apartment here, so we pretend to be genuine sea changers, but we still keep contacts with this marvellous metropolis, this throbbing...
I want to ask you about this marvellous metropolis. Here we are in the lion's den of controversy as far as the headlines in the paper last week in terms of your spat with the STC. But when you first came to Sydney from Melbourne, you came saying that you thought that this was a more creatively adventurous and risk-taking city. Do you still think that today?
Well, I think that the main thing I came north for was the geography, the climate. Since I was a little kid, I used to love going to a subtropical place, and the truth is that I was always entranced. That's why we're further north now, towards the tropics. But yeah, I did think Sydney was a more genuinely Australian city and more ready to accept Australian work. I always felt Melbourne was very class stratified. There was Toorak, there was Melbourne grammar, there was Geelong grammar, there were accents, there were, I never found that to be true in Sydney. It always felt like a genuine Australian city.
So even when you x-rayed Sydney's flaws in Emerald City, you didn't kind of realise that there was class here, but it was disguised as something else? Of course you did. You worked that out.
Oh, yes, but it wasn't projected as much as Melbourne. The accents of Toorak were still... there was a sense in Melbourne at the time I was still there that it was still trying to be Britain in certain areas of life. There was never a sense that Sydney was trying to be home, as they used to say. Yeah.
There's that memorable incident in the book, actually, Kristin, you know, where you talk about the ladies being sent out at a dinner so that the men could drink their port and gossip, and you protesting at that. Was that at the
Governor General?
At the Governor General's. And in fact, that happened to me in the first year that I came to Australia from the UK in Melbourne. And I was just astonished. I had no idea that tradition had carried here, or why anybody would want to do that.
Absolutely, it was a shock to me.
But you gave him hell, didn't you?
Well, I just quietly said under my breath as I was being ushered out with all the other ladies.
Quietly? I object to this.
I did not.
I'm ducking, I'm trying to hide under the table. And
I just said quietly,
Yeah.
I do object to this, you know. And then I walked out. And then we were in, all the ladies in the loo, we were trying to, we must do something about this, it's shocking. And so the governor was...
Poor old Sister Zelman Cowan staggered out in shock.
Lovely chap, awfully nice. And after we had been banished and brought back in, and the chaps had all had their port and cigar and told dirty stories or whatever it is they do, well, they came and he called me aside and we had a little chat. And he asked me why I objected to it, and I told him quietly. And then it was abandoned from then on. There was no more of that stuff.
Good for you.
Which was awfully good of him, too.
What she hasn't put in the book is how she terrorised powerful men for the first 15 years of my marriage.
Tell us.
I don't know that this is what we want to hear.
She was a fire-eating feminist, and I mean it. And I remember being at a dinner party with poor old Dino De Laurentiis, the eminent Italian film producer. And the second question she asked him, she was sitting next to him, was, Dino, how could someone who made a film as sensitive as La Strada make Conan the Barbarian? and the table just froze. And little Dino leapt up. Well, he didn't leap far, he's only very short, but he leapt up. And it was on for young and old. And here again, I was hiding under the table.
But presumably, David, that's what attracted you to Kristin in the first place.
I guess so, yeah.
I was protecting him in the first place. He was not one I was persecuting. Isn't that true?
Yes, that's very right.
When we look at the plays, Kristin, you say in the book that you realise over time that basically every female character whose name starts with the initial K is a variation on the theme of you. So of all the incarnations of you that exist from David's pen, which is your favourite you?
Gosh, I don't know. They're all terribly embarrassing, I have to say, because I would have said something I thought was perfectly normal, and then it would appear on stage, and everyone would laugh, and I'd think, I didn't mean it to be funny. But, yeah, no, it was quite, some were worse. There was one character called Kirsty, and she was quite nice, I think. She was in What Have You Died Tomorrow?
Yes.
She was a kind of vague hippie person. It was when we moved to the bush in a mud brick house, and it was very close to things I had said, but at least they were not unpleasant.
But has he shown you things about yourself, seriously, that have taught you something about your character? I mean, is David's writing like a mirror, where you are forced to look at things about yourself that you haven't looked at before?
Yes, I guess that's true. I mean, satirically, he does wonderful satirical portraits of lots of people, but I could see that this Kirsty character, for example, although she pretended to be vague and peaceful, she was actually quite fiery and wanted her own way. And yeah, I guess I thought, oh, am I really like that? Oh, and then there was a terrible character. Oh, what was her name?
Let's move on.
No, let's not. Let's not.
Yes, the one.
But in my latest play, at the Ensemble, doing very good business.
Shameless. Shameless.
There's a character called Roz.
Roz.
No K's, and you claim it's still you, but I think she's absolutely lovely.
You said it was me. But I said, why is she called Roz and not something starting with K? And he said, well, it's a nice rolling, sort of peaceful thing. You've got, what did you say, tamer? No.
Well, yes, you've got more bucolic.
I don't know if I like that very much, but there you are.
No.
She's quite sort of tolerant, isn't she?
She is, yeah.
Well, that's interesting, because one of the things that I think does come out quite strongly in the book is that, often with just cause, David, you are quite a good hater.
Not a long-term hater, though.
Well, I'd say a medium-term hater, then. If you're not a long-term, you're a medium.
That very critic I bent backwards over the piano, poor James Waits, he's now a friend. He's probably scared I'll do it again. I don't know.
Well, what I wanted to know from you, Kristin, is whether you see yourself as a good hater. Can you bear a grudge for a long time?
I hope not. I really hope not. I don't think so.
Even
I'm trying
against
to think
Bob
of
Ellis?
someone who's done something wrong to
Bob
me.
Ellis seems to be the sort of Iago. I think
Yeah.
Louis Nara, in his review of the book, referred to him as the Iago of the book.
Oh, yeah. It's sort of a joke of that, in a way. I mean, it wasn't a joke to David. But I always found Bob Ellis's writing amusing until he wrote a nasty thing about David, and I thought that was a bit below the belt. But I don't hate anyone, I can honestly say.
No, my inclination is to try and re-establish connections if there's been a falling out. I had a terrible falling out with Wayne Harrison over the way he directed Heretic, but within 2 years Wayne was directing one of my plays and we were communicating perfectly well. I try not to be a long-term hater. Bob Ellis, well...
He's looking forward to you signing his copy of the book in the foyer afterwards, actually. Let's talk a little bit about, I think one of the things that fascinates people about you and is in a sense part of the kind of myth, if you like, of you as a couple, is rivalry. I thought it was very interesting the way you described the genesis of David's play Siren. So would you like to say a little bit about that from your point of view?
Yes. Well, I don't know that I would. But he had lived an experience that was unpleasant for everybody in the family, and it was over. And he then tried to analyse why he behaved the way he did in writing 2 plays. Siren was the most close to it, and there was another one, Top Silk. But, yeah, so... I was feeling disturbed about the whole thing afterwards too. So I wrote a short story called the Siren syndrome, which I had a friend who was a psychologist, and she had told me about this thing that was happening where certain women would try to attract married men, particularly apparently happily married men with some status in the community, and then they would get them and then they would drop them. It was like a sport. And so I thought, this is astonishing and it's worth writing a story about, particularly as it just sort of happened to us. So I wrote this story. I told David about it, and a bit later he said, I've written a play. I'm writing a play, and it's the Siren. It's Siren. I said, you can't do that. It's my material. And he said, it's my material too. I just lived it. And I said, I couldn't argue against that. So I withdrew. I was quite cross, I have to say, but I did withdraw and didn't ever try to publish the story.
So has there been that kind of tension and competition between you again, and has it always been the case that you've deferred to him? I
can't think of an example, can you? Where?
No, I think in a sense that Kristin being a novelist and a prose writer and me being a playwright lessens that competition. We're working in different fields. I don't want to speak for you, but that I've never seen that. There's a lot of cooperation in our household because Kristin, I shouldn't say this, she's a technological...
Wizard?
No.
Not. Right, okay.
It's like, David, that thing's gone off my screen again.
So you're Mr. Tech Support.
Yeah, I'm Mr. Tech Support. Researcher, tech support, whatever.
Yes, TI, I have technical incompetence, and he has DB.
So you have
domestic blindness.
Well, apparently, according to Norman Doidge, whom I was interviewing here yesterday, women see spatially differently from men, and that's why men can never find anything in the fridge. So there is a scientific basis for that, apparently.
Oh.
But it seems to me that you've both got things that you can withhold from each other, apart from the obvious things within a marriage that one can withhold. But you can withhold food, and you can withhold technical support.
That's right. It's a very, very balanced marriage.
Yeah, it seems to work. What about the scenario then, David, where you might want to write novels one day? Has that ever occurred to you?
No, I got that over very, very early. I used to write reams and reams of bad prose, but I realised when I started writing for actors that that's what I could do. I could put words in. I write for performance, and that's what I do. I've never been a good prose writer, whereas Kristin is a very good prose writer.
Well, let's just go back to the subject matter of Siren for a moment, because I don't want to get into the kind of personal nitty-gritty, because all the adultery stuff is the stuff that's really been aired in extracts and in all of the sort of media coverage of the book. But there are two things that I want to know. With the adultery list that you suggested that Kristin make of the men that she could possibly go off and have.
No, I didn't suggest.
Okay,
she just went ahead and made it.
Oh, she went ahead and made the list. All right, okay. But in one of your plays, don't you think that the sort of more comic scenario surely would be for a couple to sit down and make that list together?
Oh,
absolutely.
No, I don't think so. I wouldn't like him to know who I was interested in. But
it cured me very quickly when I heard that there was a list being drawn up and some of it had already been acted upon. I decided open marriage wasn't such a good idea.
It was a very stupid period.
Well,
it was the 70s when there was this book written called Open Marriage. And a lot of people read it and they thought, oh, this sounds pretty good, let's try this. But, it was a stupid idea. We both realised it was utterly stupid. But David was acting upon it, and he was often out of the country and had the freedom to do so and was well known. And I was at home with the children, and I thought, gee, I can't do this. How am I going to have time? And I had a job, so I made a list of possible people I could bear to sleep with, very briefly. And they had
a pretty long list, wasn't it?
No, it was only no, it was very short. There were 5 on it, and they had to have certain qualifications. They had to be left-wing. They had to be not too ugly, not married to or involved with any woman I knew or cared about, and so it was a very short list.